expectancy falls over the Gannick Lecture Theatre. Welcome to Grand Rounds. Professor Brian Williams from Stirling is speaking today. He's the director of the CSO's NMAP research unit over in Stirling. He worked here in Dundee for 12 years. 14 or 15, he tells me. He left 4 years ago. He headed up the behavioural sciences team here in the undergraduate curriculum, and he's going to talk to us about his work with the CSO. But first, we have the usual parish notices. In the news this week, medical student Christopher McCann has been awarded £10,000 to develop his business idea at this year's Scottish Institute for Enterprise Student Summit in Edinburgh. He'll use this £10,000 summit to buy new clothes and beer. No, it says here, to develop Snap 40, a wearable patient health early warning system, and an idea that he composed whilst working on the wards of busy city hospitals. This device monitors a wide range of patient health indicators, analyses the information and sends the signals if there's a deterioration in any patient, and the wristband will help cut the number of unnecessary admissions to hospitals, he thinks, helping the NHS reduce waiting times and bed blocking. Christopher's a bit of an entrepreneur in the medical school, and he's actually going to take a year out of the course to go and develop this, something we're very excited about in the medical school. If you are a final year medical student and you're actually in the room rather than having a sandwich and walking away, the National Student Survey is still open. We are now just over 70% complete. If you do fill the forms in, there's a chance to win an iPad or a visit to the ball, and as ever, the dentists are winning. But we can catch them up. On the 5th of May, Dr. Michael Gordon, a distinguished geriatrician and palliative care specialist from Toronto's Baycrest Centre, is here to deliver a lecture entitled Managing Ethical Challenges in Late-Stage Dementia, Tuesday in here, 4 p.m. And I remind you, as we do every week, that there is a conference in St Andrews in late August, and the Farr Institute is based here in Dundee, and is the lead for Scotland. So if you're interested in going to this conference, please visit the website. Next week, Steve McSwiggan, who you heard about earlier last year, one of our colleagues in the nursing school, he went to Liberia to help treat patients with Ebola, and he's going to come and speak about his experiences with that. So last year, the last Ebola talk got record audiences. We have standing room only, so I'm sure it'll be an interesting talk for follow-up. And I will now leave you with Professor Brian Williams, who, if I can make the technology work. Thanks very much, Brian. Here we go. Thanks very much.
Right, well, it's nice to be back. I have to say this lecture theatre didn't look anything like what it looks now. I did wonder actually when I left 4 years ago, because I don't think they replaced me, what they did with the salary saving. And now I'm starting to get a little bit of a sense. It's very nice, isn't it? It's far less intimidating than the steep one that was there before. I'm the Director of the Chief Scientist Office, Nursing, Midwifery and Allied Health Professions Research Unit. I'm just going to say 30 seconds about what we do. It's basically applied health services research across the whole of Scotland. We have a national remit. We're now up to about 55, 60 members of staff spread across Glasgow Caledonian University and Stirling University. So we conduct a range of very applied research, running several randomised control trials, realist evaluations of very complex NHS interventions, and a range of sort of systematic reviews, Cochrane reviews, etc. So we're multi-method. I want to give that as a bit of context with regard to what I'm about to say today, because I wouldn't want you to think, well, Brian comes from a bit of a nursing background, it must be he's just going to have this go about the value of qualitative research, because that's a little bit all behind the times. So I think I gave this talk at the college retreat, and I did say I had a heavy cold at the time. So when I think Fiona asked me to come back, I had mixed feelings about that. I was wondering, well, could you not follow it the first time? And we'll see. Those of you involved in education, I thought I'd start off by putting this woman's picture up. It's actually Sarah Nettleton, who's a professor in the University of York, and is probably the person who's had the most influence on my career. She was my medical sociology lecturer about almost 30 years ago, I suppose now. And still remember the day when she gave me an essay to do, which was entitled, and this is a good sociology type essay, Medical Knowledge No Less Than Social Knowledge is Socially Constructed, Discuss. I hadn't got the foggiest what that meant. I really didn't. Anyway, what it meant was I disappeared into an abyss of the sort of the philosophy of knowledge and the sort of to find out that apparently we all live in a reasonably relativist abyss and knowledge isn't really attainable. So it's a rather enjoyable piece of work, which finished with me saying at the end of my essay, agreeing that this may well be the case, but given that all knowledge was relative, there was no absolute standard against which my essay could be judged. And irrespective of what she happened to think, it deserved an A. And whether she gave me an A or not, it still deserved an A. And there was no way this could be refuted. So she forgave me and she gave me an A. But the reason why I put this up here now is she wrote a paper in Sociology of Health and Illness entitled Protecting a Vulnerable Margin Towards an Analysis of How the Mouth Came to be Separated from the Body. You know, sociologists, they love these sorts of titles. What in the world does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means. It's why is dentistry not part of medicine? How and why, historically, did we take a part of the body away and give it to a different profession? How did that happen? In a sense, that's at the core of what I want to talk about today, and it's the way in which we fractured knowledge historically and the sort of pros and cons of bringing things together. And within our contemporary NHS, the pros and cons around the relationship between education research and health services research, and why, in a sense, education research is doesn't really get access to the sort of funding that I think it really should do. So this talk is partly therapeutic for me because this sort of drives me a bit nuts. And I wish we could do something about it. So what I want to talk about is the fracturing of knowledge, looking about that separation of education from HSR, look at some of the implications of that, and then highlight a few opportunities ahead, because for somebody who wants to grab the opportunities ahead, I think that they are really real and really very, very substantial. So what about this fracturing of knowledge? Was it interesting when you look across a whole range of disciplines? Quite often you'll find in the undergraduate curriculum, you'll get a number of thinkers who seem to be taught across a range of disciplines. Now, whether that happens to be people like Immanuel Kant or Sigmund Freud, I know some of you medical students here will be thinking, actually, well, they didn't come up in our curriculum. All I can say is, well, they did when I was here. Certainly within the first week of the undergraduate curriculum, I had a lecture on the philosophy of knowledge. And it's just going back 200 to 300 years, and we didn't really have these separate disciplines. We really just had natural philosophy and moral philosophy, which meant the talk of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary collaboration wasn't really there. Why? Because all the disciplines weren't particularly existing. So if I take this guy, this is Thomas Malthus, who wrote an essay on the principle of population. I think it was in 1798. And some of you might have studied geography in the past, although he wasn't a geographer. He wasn't anything in particular. He's a natural philosopher, probably, more known for demography and political economy than pure geography. But he was the guy who argued that population increases geometrically while food supply increases arithmetically, which means every now and again your population hugely surpasses your ability to provide food, and there happens to be a population crash. Now, it's interesting at the time that we get a quote, well, some years later, and I'll give it to you. In October 1838, that is, 15 months after I'd begun my systematic inquiry, I happened to read, for amusement, Malthus on Population, as many people did. It was a funny book, I guess. And being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on from long continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favourable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavourable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of a new species. Here then I had at last got a theory by which to work. And that was Charles Darwin from his autobiography about where some of his ideas for the origin of species happened to come. It was that at the time, the lack of those interdisciplinarity, which meant that natural philosophers or moral philosophers at the time were naturally reading each other's work, not thinking about whether people were in different disciplines, not necessarily being patronising about the quality of the evidence and the argument which existed within those. In a sense, sometimes we seem to have lost that. Now, part of the reason for this was obviously post-industrial revolution. Part of the explanation for that was the specialisation of labour in itself. And here's a guy from Kirkcaldy, Sir Adam Smith, who wrote an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. And it was Smith who really argued for the increase in productivity of the division and specialisation of labour. And at the time he was using the example of the pin factory. I'm not sure if many of you are familiar with this, but I'll give you another few words that he says. In thinking this is pins as in small nails. And really what he looked at was the ways in which a series of about 10, 15 or 18 men had divided up the manufacture of a pin into specialised forms. He said, "I've seen a small manufactory of this kind where 10 men only were employed. They could, when they exerted themselves, make among them about 12 pounds of pins in a day. There are in a pound upwards of 4,000 pins of a middling size. Those 10 persons, therefore, could make among them upwards of 48,000 pins in a day. But if they had all been wrought separately and independently, and without any of them having been educated to this particular business, they would certainly not have made many at all." It's a classic example, and it's probably more familiar to you than you realise, and I'll explain why a little bit later on. But the division, the specialisation of manufacturing labour, it demonstrated it was incredibly productive. So it wasn't particularly unusual. I should say that's the pin factory itself. It wasn't surprising that certainly after the Enlightenment, we started to get similar divisions of labour within knowledge in itself. And natural philosophy started to become divided into natural science, physics, chemistry, biology, etc., and moral philosophy into these other areas. And there's a rationale behind that as well. I mean, there are benefits, and I'm not going to deny that, of professional knowledge specialisation. It simply means that we can, every individual working in that process, for example in the pin factory, you become particularly good at it. You know the intricacies, you can address all the contingencies that exist, you can be more productive at that particular job. Because of that, it can enhance productivity, and not just productivity itself, the actual quality of the thing that you produce at the end of the day. And finally, there is an argument that specialisation creates an identity. You feel more valued because you have a very specific expertise that not everybody else happens to have. It can produce a real community, and with that a potential career and a set of professions. Now there are arguments against that as well. I mean, Karl Marx came along and said basically, that subdivision of labour really means that you end up becoming alienated from the product. You end up doing a very, very specific job and you lose all your satisfaction because you don't really have a direct ownership of the thing you're creating at the other end. But, having said that, you can see how some of these issues can certainly apply to the development of disciplines, whether that be physics, chemistry, whatever, and arguably for the development of health services research and education research itself as well. And we need it. We really do need it. This might be a little bit small, but what it shows is an increase in the percentage of people attending, for example, higher education institutes within the United Kingdom between about 2002 2012, which went up by around 500,000 people. And if we're putting that amount of people through HEIs and that amount of funding, then certainly what we really need is to make sure that the evidence base of delivering those interventions, so the educational, is actually there. For educational research in the NHS as well, I'd certainly argue that that's needed increasingly. Those challenges that we're all aware of within the NHS are there, they're growing all the time. That ageing population, the increases in comorbidity, the complexity of healthcare that we're facing all the time is certainly growing. Simple interventions of the past don't necessarily transfer either. And then we can start to look at some of the other complexities of contemporary healthcare with raised patient expectations, our increasing concern about issues of patient-centredness and dignity, the lack of those that can lead to poor clinical outcomes, and what we see in mid-staffs and the subsequent Francis inquiry. All of those are things, the challenges that we really need, and in a sense, education research is one of the potential solutions. But education research, it'd be interesting to know exactly when the idea of education research began. The earliest I can get to was probably data being collected in UK schools in about the 1830s and 1840s, but it wasn't really formalised into a body of knowledge until very much later. But the point is that education research has been around for a long time. Health services research, on the other hand, is a much younger discipline in itself. The term really first began in the early 60s in two American journals, Inquiry and Medical Care, then through to the National Centre for Health Services Research and Development. In the 1980s, one journal, Quality Journal, suddenly arises and HSR gains some traction, and then the Cochrane collaboration in 1993, which many of you should be aware of. And then finally, in 1996, not that long ago, it was only then when we had the first main methodological textbook for health services research. And very soon after, the Health Services, Journal of Health Services Research and Policy. And even in that, when that was first begun, it admitted it was a relatively new field. Health services research is a relatively new field of applied science. It's growing rapidly in many countries as governments, funders and providers come to recognise the contribution which rigorous research can make as they grapple with rising costs, rapid technological innovation, a lack of evidence of what is effective and significant variations in clinical practice. So as healthcare is becoming more demanding, more costly, then this new discipline was certainly emerging from the 1960s onwards. It's really from the 1990s we're talking. And as that happened, the amount of research funding that went into health services research grew really quite rapidly. And certainly within, it seems to me, most healthcare curricula as well, those sort of HSR research methods became more prevalent. But education research was never part of that. It was never part of that growth. And it seems to me incredibly, really quite bizarre why education research was never part of health services research. There had been that sort of continued separation. So what might be the reasons for that? Well, this is a gravestone. I'm not sure if you can quite read it, but this is the gravestone of a guy called John Marshall Clemens. You've probably never heard of John Marshall Clemens, but I think he's almost the human embodiment of education research within the United Kingdom. And why? Well, it's really because of his role in a very famous quote by this man, Samuel Langhorne Clemens. I'm not sure if anybody of you recognise him because he's really known by a completely different name. It is Mark Twain, absolutely. And one of my favourite quotes from Mark Twain was when he said, when I was 14, and he was talking about his father here, John Marshall Clemens, when I was 14, my father was so ignorant I could barely stand to have the old man around. But by the time I was 21, I was shocked to discover just how much he'd learnt in such a short period of time. And there is that sort of arrogance of youth that means that when we look at what we've learnt and we look outside, we think we're ahead of the field. And for me, health services research in the 1980s and 1990s was incredibly guilty of that sort of methodological arrogance when it was looking at education research. And as a result, we're poorer for it. 1980s, 1990s, this is sort of early parts of my research career, then the research ethos at the time was very much about only experimental research was valid. The confident, pervasive ethos at the time was to prove causation and then just do it. We forget about all the implementation side of things. Experimental methods were the only way of really proving causation. I could take issue, I could probably give a talk on each one of these and take them apart and have a bit of a rant at the same time. Even the word proof there, problematic. The context was, generally speaking, irrelevant. The non-experimental work was poor quality. Qualitative research was naive. There really wasn't an engagement in process issues within healthcare. And then that staff issues and behaviours were secondary to clinical interventions themselves. Things have changed hugely. They really have. And if you were working doing applied health services research in the 80s and early 90s with this and trying to get research funding for research that was really addressing some of these issues, you were up against it. It was extremely difficult. 2015, well, things have changed. Even from 2000 onwards, when the Medical Research Council published its framework for the development and evaluation of complex interventions, we were now entering a healthcare system for which we wanted to evaluate interventions which weren't necessarily pharmaceutical. These were interventions which were far more complex. They were harder to define. They weren't simple. I mean, a tablet may well be physiologically quite complex, but you can see, you can touch it, you can count it, you can put it in a jar. But as we move forward to changing issues, say, for example, water culture, or to thinking about therapeutic interventions, which might be spoken interventions, we need all of these things, but they're much harder to define and much harder to research. And the Medical Research Council in 2000 onwards recognised that. Recognised at the same time that context was also crucial. The more ingredients you have which are active within an intervention, the more likely that those actually are only effective in certain contexts and not others. In which case, just because an intervention happens to work in one particular trial does not necessarily mean it's going to work just as well in multiple contexts. Even the longevity of those interventions in terms of their effectiveness change, because if a complex intervention is dependent upon context for effectiveness, well, those contexts change over time. We can fix and we can standardise our intervention, but actually we can't do that. Try to do that with the NHS, wouldn't we love it? But no, the NHS moves on. So there are major challenges. So as a result, the Medical Research Council would certainly argue now that understanding process is vital, not just that an intervention works, but how and why. Those complex evaluative methods are frequently preferable. We submitted a grant application to the National Institute for Health Research about 2 years ago for a cluster randomised trial for an intervention that changed staff behaviour. They came back to us and said, we don't think an experimental method is appropriate here. Will you please submit something like a realist evaluation, which is an observational sort of method. This is the way in which funders have now changed. The qualitative research is needed in every evaluation. Now, it's not necessarily done particularly well, but embedding it within those trials to understand exactly what happened now is almost standard. And action research, which would have been questioned even 15 years ago, is this research at all and are you just playing, is actually funded as an intervention itself in many contexts. So things have changed. The irony is that all of these things were what education research has been saying for the past 20 or 30 years. In the 1980s and 90s, health services research in that form didn't want to hear it, but largely looked down on people doing that type of research and saying they were doing poor quality work. They weren't. They were doing high quality work in a very, very difficult environment and challenging the methodological issues that they faced and coming up with some very innovative solutions at that time. HSR just wasn't willing to hear it. So we end up in a place now for health services research where a lot of education research probably was about 20 to 25 years ago. But it's not going to admit that, which is a real shame. Now, one of the other reasons for this, apart from what might be regarded as some form of academic arrogance, might be there's some sort of concept of lock-in. I mean, research progresses not just through intellectual engagement, but the availability of funding to support it. I mean, I guess for most of you now employed within this university, you can engage in some research if you're bringing in research income to cover your staff costs and the full economic costs around it. If it's unfunded, then you're not going to progress. So we have something like the National Institute for Health Research, say the HSDR programme, that funds health services research to produce evidence on the quality, accessibility and organisation of health services. Includes evaluations of how the NHS might improve delivery of services. The audience is public service users, clinicians and managers. Now surely education is designed to do exactly this. Surely it is. Well, there's not a single mention of education research on that entire website. Now that doesn't mean they won't fund it. They're just not saying that they will. I certainly emailed him yesterday to ask him, well, do you fund it or not? And I got the response, well, what do you have in mind? Which wasn't the most sort of encouraging sort of thing. Well, I thought, well, okay, perhaps I'll just call it something else, and you might fund it. But you do get this sort of lock-in. Why? Because the people who are sitting on the funding committee and on the prioritisation are not education researchers themselves. They will be coming from a traditional health service research background. And if we can't actually get the research income to do high-quality education research, then it's hard actually to demonstrate some of its benefit. And I'll come back to this at the end because I think there are solutions around this. But it is like that sort of that concept of lock-in. I'm not sure if you've heard about it before. Originally it comes from complexity theory, I think. But if you take something like this is a Dvorak keyboard. It looks a bit weird because it doesn't have QWERTY at the top. This keyboard is more efficient. We know from studies, okay, experimental study, this keyboard will improve your productivity when it comes to writing. Probably not the quality of what you're writing, but actually your speed of production. But it's not used anywhere. Or why not? Well, because the QWERTY keyboard was introduced first, and actually the cost of shifting from the QWERTY keyboard to this and retraining everybody who's got their fingers and their brain incredibly used to a QWERTY keyboard is just not financially worth it. I'm not sure if you ever noticed this. I've got no ideas where the keys are on a keyboard. My fingers do. I'm not sure quite how that works neurologically. If I try to spell a word, my fingers will go to that particular point. That works with a QWERTY keyboard, but we can't. But this concept of lock-in means it's not really financially worthwhile retraining everybody. The same happened historically, between VHS and Betamax. It's why Los Angeles has a huge smog problem, but almost no public transport. We can look at these these things, they don't make sense in many ways. But we end up in a system and a structure which reinforces the status quo, and somehow we need to find our way out of that. So, what's the implications of fracturing this sort of knowledge? Just check the time. There's no clock in here, is there? So hopefully should be time for some questions, a bit of chatter around this. What's the implications of that? Well, quick summary, the NHS has 1.3 million people. It's a vast organisation. We have 2.5 million students in HEIs at the moment. That's growing. We have an NHS budget worth, not quite sure when I got these figures, it might be a year or two old now, 128 billion, is certainly increasing every year. Education budget certainly quite a lot lower. And I mean, these are vast industries. They really are. And we're producing, in terms of the outcomes we're producing, one would expect the R&D budget around sort of education to be pretty significant. What is it? I don't know. I've searched everywhere to find out what is the education, how much money goes into education research within HEIs and within the NHS. You can't actually find the figure. You can't. It's very difficult to find out which funding bodies are spending what on education research. We could make a comparison, though. If we compare something like education research to public health research, then it raises a few questions. So, for example, I know it sounds like a strange comparison, but I think it probably holds. Public health research focuses on interests of widespread public interest. It prioritises primary prevention over cure. Now, isn't that what education is all about? It's looking at it in terms of preventive sort of way. It's changing things at source to improve outcomes much lower down the chain. Most public health research locates some causes in knowledge, attitudes, behaviour. So does education research. It acknowledges the individual and associated social groupings, and at the same time it looks at the importance of context in both causes and solutions. Even the methods aren't that dissimilar. If we look at complex community public health interventions, they're rarely ever experimental nowadays. They're usually really quite complex sort of evaluations. Well, the research budget for those is really quite significant. It's 10 million a year from the public health programme at NIHR. It's public health schools worth another 20 million over the next 5 years, and most of other public funding streams for public health actually do fund public health initiatives as well, which means there's a sort of iceberg effect there as well. There's a vast amount of money. We still don't know what is going into education research, but what we do know is it'll be an awful lot less than this, and it's not clear where to get to, and it just doesn't seem to make sense. So there's a number of consequences there. First of all, there's that failure of health services research to learn from education theory and method. And it should have learned many of these methodological lessons really quite a long time ago. What this also means is that there's a failure to support research into what's probably the largest behaviour change intervention available to the NHS. I mean, the number of people we put through medical schools, through nursing, through all the allied health professions every year, it's a vast number of people. It's a huge intervention which is being funded at extreme cost. But actually, what is the impact on service outcomes and clinical outcomes from all of that? And at least we should surely be researching that. And why are there interventions which are educational? Why is it not seen as part of health services research itself? And it will be, and it'll start to creep back in there. It was very difficult to see in the context of the sort of mid-staffs post-Francis, where NIHR was commissioning calls for research, that interventions at an educational level were not going to be funded, and they were. They just weren't called education research. It wasn't really supporting the sector. So, I do think there are some opportunities and challenges here, and they're quite varied, but I think it takes a reasonably assertive and aggressive stance to reclaim some of the territory here, but I think it is important and it is worth it. The first, I think, is about reclaiming the historical narrative. Education research as a brand, and I may be wrong here, it's still not anywhere near as strong as it should be. If you're engaged in education research, you may well feel reasonably undervalued compared to people working within laboratories or within applied health services research who are bringing in vast amounts of money. But the contribution to clinical outcomes is probably enormous. It's probably bigger than much else. And also the credit that you should be given for the development of health services research has not really been made. So for me, it is about the time when education research should be actually singing its praises, looking back at its history, looking at the methodological arguments it's been putting in the past and saying, look, we have been saying this for years. Thank you now, finally, for acknowledging what we've been doing. And please look again at some of our contemporary work. So I think it is okay to say I told you so. Those narratives, they do have a beginning, a middle and an end. And we'll come back to the end bit a little bit later. But that storyline about education research, nobody's telling it at the moment. It just looks like health services research came out of the blues from the 1960s, was refined in the 1990s, and is largely trying to solve contemporary problems. Education research has been doing that all that time, and education research is largely where much HSR around complex interventions has its origins today. So the endpoint is about updating contemporary reputation and contribution. Somebody once told me quite a while ago that when I was leading one research institute, that you've got to go out there and tell your story, because if you don't tell it, somebody else will tell it for you. And for me, when I look around at education research, other people have been telling the story of education research on their behalf for quite some time, about what it is, what it isn't, what the quality of the research is. And it needs somebody to stand up and really speak its praises. There are other issues as well, ways forward. I think this whole concept of scholarly activity, I'm not sure whether many academics still have that sometimes listed within their contracts, particularly if I'm more of a teaching contract, you'll have this concept of scholarly activity. I wish somebody would tell me quite what it meant. I have looked around. The closest you can get is what it comes to mind at this bust of Socrates. What it does put in my mind, though, is the fact that we, at the moment, I wouldn't say quite a tyranny, but what we are in is a society which prioritises one kind of evidence over another, and that's the empirical over the rational. And I can just start to feel myself getting carried away in a second, but never mind. Let's go with it. When I was here in Dundee, the first week of the undergraduate curriculum, I argued for the inclusion of a lecture on the philosophy of knowledge, which was a little bit of a tour de force starting off in the 1600s and arguing that knowledge and where we got knowledge from, we really should look at that. 15th, 16th century prior to that, most knowledge in society would have been put down to religious revelation. It was in a text somewhere and you happen to believe it. Why? Because it was there. Even in the context of medicine, that was still there because people would have been praising the work of Galen at the time. And then you came through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and you had two schools of thought about the acquisition of knowledge. If we can't trust, I'm going to get carried away. How long have you got? There you end up getting people who are questioning, where do we get knowledge from? If we can't trust revelatory texts, where does knowledge come from? And you end up with two schools of thought. You get the empiricist school, which says that all knowledge has got to come from experience, the way in which you engage in the world on a day-to-day basis. And we'll engage with the world and build up little tiny experiential blocks of knowledge and build up from that. And that was the school of philosophers from Francis Bacon onwards. And then you get somebody like Descartes who came along who said, no, you cannot trust your senses. And we could do that with lots of optical illusions or whatever. You cannot trust your senses. In which case the whole idea of sort of building blocks of empirical knowledge falls away and you know nothing. Which put Descartes in that Woody Allen sort of mould of sort of hyperbolic doubt. He knew nothing. Descartes knew absolutely nothing at all. The only thing he knew was that he knew nothing. He doubted. So I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. That was the heart of Descartes' rationalism. That's the building block of all knowledge. But you had those two schools of thought. The empiricism of Bacon that goes onto Scottish philosophers like Hume, and then onto people and from the rationalist school. And that still stands today. The evidence itself today is not only empirical, it's not only data, it's logic, rationale and reason all the time. It is the quality of the thinking that takes place. Not just empirical data. Logic and reasoning is evidence in and of itself. And for me, that liberates you up to see the new worlds in different ways. Even empirical quantitative data, it starts with reasoning. It starts with rationale because you have to count something. And what are you counting? You're counting something which you've conceptualized. And you're only conceptualizing it that way because you see the world with that word and that thing. I'm probably losing some of you at this particular point. But rationale and reasoning helps you to see the world in a different way. It helps creativity. It helps the quality of argument. And that's what people like Socrates would have been all about. It wasn't about empirical evidence. And that's, for me, what scholarly activity can do. It frees you up to think about in different ways. One of the frustrations I've had now for the last 10 years is I'm too busy being a researcher to be an academic. I've got to produce the papers. I've got to produce the grants. And yet the best paper I ever wrote was my first paper when I was writing a PhD. It was around patient satisfaction, when I had the time to think. I didn't know much about the topic at the time, and it was that helped me to think something innovatively. You know, the students and staff in my unit now, even when they're doing any piece of research, I'll get them, say to them, don't look at the literature. Don't look at literature to start off with, because if you want to think out the box, don't get it in the first place. Okay? Think fresh, think new, think rationally, think logically, and that'll be creative. And there's a room, that is what scholarly activity is all about. There's probably not a great deal of room for people like Socrates nowadays. If I just read you a few characteristics of him, he had no PhD, no publications. He freely admitted that he didn't know anything. He spent too much time at parties, wore a bedsheet and no shoes. He set no curriculum and no exams. He let anybody into his classes, didn't charge for instructions, thought teachers who take money for their instructions are immoral sophists. He had no teaching experience, he was past retirement age, and he had suicidal tendency, a criminal record. Dundee Medical School would not employ him, I'm fairly sure. And if they did, he'd probably be out fairly soon because he didn't meet ref criteria. But scholarly activity is an incredibly rich theme. There's a book published last year entitled In Praise of Being Idle, and that wasn't the same as being lazy. It was having the ability the space to think creatively in new ways. And within education research, I think that there's room for that high-quality scholarly activity which can really challenge the status quo by freeing people up to think and to stand back and question and not be dominated by the empirical nature of research which is around it. And for that, I think there's huge amounts of step forward. Now, that sort of approach, scholarly activity, thinks, well, what are you doing about that? You look at the ageing population, people dying, Francis Inquiry, and you're sitting there in a room just sort of mulling over stuff. Do you know, is it really worth it? Well, yeah, I think it would be. A little example here. I mean, this is a photograph taken from the SS Etonian in 1912, 2 days before this iceberg hit the Titanic. And if we take something like the Titanic, one of the famous quotes is around the Titanic was that it's just this idea about rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. You know, things are happening. There's this big iceberg approaching, as it sort of is in the NHS. And what are you doing about it? You're engaged in scholarly activity. Well, is that really worth it? Well, the news is yes. In 2011, there was a guy called Frank Naylor, who's a maritime historian, did some research and actually found out that actually these deck chairs float. The canvas on the deck chairs was actually waterproof. So had somebody spent a little bit of time, not panicked, not rushed, rearranged the deck chairs, they could have formed a lot of rafts. He certainly estimated that between 500 to 600 people could have been saved by rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Sometimes there is room for just calming down and thinking clearly, rationally, and in creative and novel ways. And certainly, if anything, education research can reclaim that, and still claiming that research includes thinking and the development of evidence through rational logic and reasoning. So, at the same time, I think there is that gap for thinking, skills and craft, which I've mentioned about. Coming back to that complex interventions issue, health services research has moved down a complex intervention route, and I think it's going to be in trouble in about 5, 6, 7, 8 years' time, and I'll explain why, and I think some of the solution might lie in education research, because it's to do with thinking skills and reasoning. Interventions can be very complex dependent. So we've got 2 interventions we've been evaluating here within Tayside: changing ward culture amongst nurses, caring behaviours assurance system, and releasing time to care. These are very, very complicated interventions, multiple components trying to change things, but they're very, very context dependent. So I do a study, and we have done, we've got the data, we're just finishing the analysis now, and we find out they work. Okay, they work, that's great. So now I've got really strong evidence that these interventions work and possibly why. But actually, how long will those findings hold for? Because if those interventions are context dependent, well, in 6 months' time, has the context changed so much that those interventions will not be effective anymore? I don't know, 12 months, 2 years? Well, it probably won't be. In other words, as we're moving in health services research down the complex intervention route, unless we're careful, we develop an evidence base for what works, but we don't know when it'll stop working. When the world has moved so far on that actually this thing doesn't happen anymore. So there starts to be some real challenges for health services research. What I think is going to happen is that evidence of health services research is going to have to shift from becoming less about the empirical. It'll still be there, don't get me wrong, but more about the rational. It's about looking at the quality of these evaluation studies of complex interventions and saying, actually, well, let's make a rational, detailed, logical judgment as to why and whether this intervention may still hold now or won't hold. There's going to be those incredibly subtle but expert interpretations of evidence as interventions become more complex. And that's a really quite complex skill set, which engages reasoning, logic, rationale, and a knowledge of research methods and evidence. For me, again, that is where education and research and the role of the rational over the empirical becomes important. As HEIs are moving down the impact terrain as well, because the research excellence framework is this time around putting 20% of quality assessment around this, it'll be greater in the future, then education research can certainly play its part as well. Impact can be defined in terms of the impact on education systems beyond your own HEI. So I think there is room here to really move things forward. But finally, what about this ongoing relationship? I've said that I think we should try and look back historically and argue that education research has had much more of an impact than it actually has. Its credibility and its quality of contemporary research should be upgraded, I think. But is there room for sort of coming together with health services research over the coming years, particularly with regard to funding? Well, I think the answer still comes back to what's on the pin factory, and it is closer to home. If you have a look at a £20 note, you'll actually find embedded within that is Adam Smith's pin factory. Within that whole process, you had people who weren't just individual academics or individual manufacturers. They were still part of that working team. Hopefully individuals who would have respected each other and would have seen in the chain of research projects or manufacturing events they needed to be working on that collaborative venture. So if it's coming back together, is it about reintegration, is it about reconstruction, or is it about collaboration? Well, I don't think education research should be swamped by health services research. It brings something really quite distinct and a real heritage to it. And I think it really needs to preserve its emphasis on scholarly activity as well. Otherwise, HSR will be poorer for it. But we do need to make sure that HSR and education research is working towards that common product and goal, and that's recognised by funders. As I said, education research is probably the biggest intervention, healthcare intervention in the United Kingdom. There is that complementarity of methods and expertise between the areas, but we also need to develop that explicit acknowledgement of each other's skills, and we are getting there. But finally, I think the real challenge for us is also part of the final explanation why I think why education research has not got the credit and isn't getting the funding that it deserves at the moment, and I think there's room to change that. I tried to get a definition of education research, and I got this one from the American Educational Research Organisation, and it's largely research that was focused on the process of achieving or educational outcomes. So it was about educational outcomes itself. And that, for me, may well be the sticking point to getting a way forward. If I think about what the Health Services and Delivery Research Programme at NIHR Fund and HSR generally, it's not about educational outcomes, it's about clinical outcomes. Or it's about service level outcomes to do with the quality and productivity of care. And we're failing to make a link between these. So if we think about this interplay of outcomes itself, education research has largely been down in this bottom left-hand corner, about looking about the ways in which we can improve educational outcomes of skills, values, knowledge, beliefs. A little bit about behaviour sometimes, but not always. Health services, what we really need to be doing is linking that education research through to service outcomes itself. So looking at ways in which education interventions are having an impact on the quality of the service which is being delivered. Now, if we can do that, then we'll certainly get increased funding. At the same time, there's that link between educational outcomes and clinical outcomes itself. And as soon as those other outcomes are subsumed within educational research or attached to it, then those funding doors certainly do open. Now, some HSR is already doing this, and in actual fact what's happening is, because we recognise the need to do this, new forms of HSR are branching off all the time, and to some degree claiming the terrain that education research should possibly do. So the area between education and service outcomes and through to clinical outcomes is, I think, is now largely being adopted by the whole area of implementation science. It's about saying, actually, we know if we do, from the evidence base in Cochrane, if we do A, then clinical benefit B will be achieved. The question is, how do we get people to engage in behaviour A? And many of the interventions now falling within implementation science, it seems to me, are educational in nature. They've got behaviour change theory embodied within them, but they're still there. So let's education research can start to reclaim the territory. It's going to get overtaken again, and its distinct contribution will lag behind. The problem is we don't have a dedicated name or language for that, and I think that's really important. Education research at the moment is about educational outcomes. What we need is, from my point of view, way forward, is some other name for the research that links education research, that enhances educational outcomes and demonstrates the link between educational and service outcomes itself. It's a type of education research, but it's the one that actually links to clinical and service level as well. Give it a name. The implementation science research, people are doing that at the moment. And as soon as you start using the term, you suddenly look around and find out there's all sorts of this type of research going on. And you can see the impact that it's having. And it's through that sort of rebranding sort of form that the quality and the reputation will be increased. Now, there are parts of the NHS and sort of education which are trying to do this. This educational outcomes framework coming out of the Department of Health in England has argued that it is doing that. It's looking at how education outcomes links to clinical outcomes itself. I've looked through this and it looks incredibly simplistic. It's a very, very good starting point. But if you want to enhance funding and push forward education research, then it is in this linkage. How does education research improve service? How does it improve clinical outcomes? It's really difficult, complex work to do, but with the emphasis on things like big data, data linkage, places like NHS Tayside and University of Dundee are incredibly well placed to do this sort of work in the longer term. If we can do it, then there is a much richer future for both education research and health services research itself. So finally then, just to summarise, I think we need a clearer understanding of the links between education outcomes and service and clinical outcomes themselves. Unless we get that, I think education research is going to just remain in a shadowy corner. We also need to revisit some of those old boundaries and definitions, because education research, as I would define it, is far more prevalent than people actually realise. It's not called that anymore. It's being taken over by things like implementation science or improvement science itself. And finally, to bring all this together, we need a small number of individuals who do actually have the ambition, the passion, the leadership to bring education research and HSR together and make the most of some of the interesting methodological opportunities we have. We haven't managed to do some of this research in the past, linking some of these things together. And to some degree, we haven't really had to quite as much. But the challenges the NHS faces means that we have to do it now. We really do. And actually, methodologically, we should be able to if somebody wants to really grab that and run with it. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much. Time is pressing, but does anybody have any questions or comments they'd like to make or ask Brian before he heads back down the A9? Oh, at the back. I'll just get you a microphone, Marion. Bear with me. Well, I would do if I could find one. Why don't you just shout? Good.
Hey, thanks, Marion. Well, in a sense, that's that's really my point as well, because I don't have the list. What I do know is that when I'm doing research on health services research now, for the sort of interventions that we want to develop, we're looking back to the educational research, or looking towards the educational theorists to say, actually, methodologically, how have you tried to address this in the past? And when we're looking back at that, they may have addressed it, but the outcomes that they've looked at are not the clinical and service outcomes. They're at the educational level itself. So in a sense, that's my point, that we haven't made these links. Logically, we should be able to link these things together, and then there should be real benefits. Instead, HSR has been learning from other areas, and obviously there are HSR interventions, but they may not be, and they've probably got educational elements to them, but they're not being paraded as such. So, what I'm not criticising here is applied health services research in terms of its contemporary or historical quality. What I'm saying is actually I think we're missing a trick to some degree, and there's a lot of education research which I think we need to be now linking through to those service and clinical outcomes to demonstrate its utility and refining in that light.
Anybody else? No, you've stunned them. Okay, well, I'd just like to thank Brian again for coming up the road and giving us his insights into this emerging field. And next week is Ebola with Steve McSwiggan. So I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks once again. Thanks for coming.